So, I left off talking about monopolistically competitive markets. So, they're really a combination of two things we've already talked about. So, we said they're kind of somewhere in between a monopoly and a perfectly competitive market. So, I think at the very end of last class, I had drawn up kind of what the market structure would look like. Right, they're going to face kind of this twice as steep marginal revenue curve because they're able to differentiate their product from the other products in the market, right? So they're very similar products, which is the idea of like, you would think about different brand, like you think about automobiles, right? They're all cars, but they've slightly differentiated their products. So they're going to be able to set, Ford can set the price for they're the only one setting the price for a Ford F-150. Even though there's a variety of trucks that are very similar substitutes. So we said they're going to face this twice as steep marginal revenue curve, and the demand curve won't quite be as inelastic as the monopoly because, if Ford starts to jack their prices up too much, everyone's just going to stop buying Ford trucks and start buying them from Chevy or whoever else, right? So when we look at their cost structure, right, it's going to look very similar to all the other firms, right? They're going to have an increasing marginal cost. That marginal cost will intersect the average total cost at its minimum point. And the optimal quantity that these firms are going to choose is still based off the same rule that every other market we've looked at, which is marginal revenue of the last unit provided is equal to the marginal cost. So once they set the quantity there, they produce that many units, they know that at that last unit supplied, the value that someone would be willing to pay for that is represented by the demand curve, right? The demand reflects marginal benefits, and people will pay up to the amount of their marginal benefit. Okay? So they can set the price somewhere above whatever the marginal cost for that last unit provided was. From there, we get profits the same way we would for a monopolist or for a perfectly competitive market, which is just how many units are they selling multiplied by the difference between price and average total cost at that quantity. Okay? So really the principles behind what we're doing with this market is no different than the other two. So here, there's positive profits, right? Whoa. One of the characteristics of a monopolistically competitive market is that firms can enter and exit freely. There's no barriers to entry. Right? So if there's positive profits for this particular good, I mean the automobiles, what might we see happen? We're going to see other companies enter this market. Yep. So the number of producers goes up, right? We said the way to think about this with monopolistic competitive markets, there is an overall demand for maybe trucks or automobiles, right? So all of the existing companies currently share that demand. Well, as more firms enter, that's going to just kind of split demand up across more companies. So we would see this kind of decrease in the demand for any one firm. So let's say firms enter and we see that demand curve shifts. Maybe there was an overreaction to the positive profits that existed because now when we look at the optimal quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost and we try to determine profits, well now because price is below the average total cost of that quantity, there we go. We're going to actually, this will represent profits, but they will be negative, all right? So thinking about the equation for profits, hopefully this is like becoming we've seen this a lot up to this point. Every single type of market we've looked at. Once average total cost goes above price there, that difference becomes negative, and so then our profit value, right? It's the same kind of, it looks like a rectangle on the graph, but it is negative. So, we could potentially, let's see here. So I don't have it up on the cost structure there because I'm kind of looking at the long run. Okay? But similar to a perfectly competitive market, let's say we've got, so I want to end up with average total cost being above price. So something like this, get the optimal quantity, that quantity here, price here. So we've got our equilibrium price and quantity. Price is below average total cost, so we know there's negative profit. Similar to a perfectly competitive market, it could be that in the short run, you have fixed costs. So in the short run, the reason why I didn't really focus on the short run as much with the monopoly is because with a monopolist, if you're currently experiencing negative profits, I mean, there's no other firms that are going to exit. So if your decision is that, as a monopolist, if you have negative profits, the exit entry or the exit or do I minimize loss decision is always just to leave. Right? Because things aren't going to get better, you're the only firm. It's not like other firms are going to leave. But in this scenario, right, potentially over time, I can eliminate some of those fixed costs. Other firms might exit the market. And if I can minimize losses in the short run, potentially in the future, I could experience, profits that are positive or even zero. So just like with a perfectly competitive firm, in the short run, they will still, even though price is below average total cost here, so we know profits will be negative, price is still above average variable costs. Okay? So you kind of think about it as, at least if we stay open here in the short run, this area, the difference between price and average variable cost, kind of represents the amount or the value that I can eat into whatever my losses would be if I just shut down. Okay? So if I shut down, I still have my fixed cost. That's going to be my, my negative profit, my losses. At least if I stay open when price is above average variable, I can reduce those losses by whatever that value is. And I won't actually necessarily ask you to calculate that, but the idea, what I want you to know is, as long as in the short run price is above average variable cost, the firm won't shut down. They'll continue to operate in order to minimize their losses. Any questions on that? Okay. So, we have these firms entering and exiting. Let's say too many entered, we end up with negative profits. What's going to happen? Some of the firms will exit. That's going to drive that demand curve back up, right? Because now there are fewer firms sharing the overall demand for the product. Eventually, we'll get to a point. I'm going to skip this for a second. Oh, I guess I don't have a. I thought I had a slide there for it. Eventually, we get to a point as firms kind of start exiting when there's negative profits. The demand curve keeps shifting back up to the point where I didn't quite go, it's quite right. But the idea would be, as firms exit, demand and marginal revenue are increasing for the firms that kind of remain, until the point where now when I'm looking at marginal cost equal marginal revenue, we get to that quantity where price, or the point that I'm at in the demand curve, I'm going to call this star, right? That's the second scenario. So that demand curve is going to shifting back up as firms exit until we get to this point where we're at a quantity where price is exactly equal to average total cost. If price is exactly equal to average total cost, profits would be zero. Right? So an interesting feature about this monopolistic competitive market is that it has the same outcome as a perfectly competitive market, in that in the long run, as firms enter and exit, right, in response to positive and negative profits, in the long run, we'll kind of get stuck at this point where they're indifferent or profits are equal to zero. So we get the profits are so even at this point where profits are equal to zero, one kind of distinct difference between perfectly competitive and monopolistically competitive firms is that they're still setting a price that's above wherever they're at on the marginal cost curve. So at this quantity, they're still at the marginal cost of that quantity is still far below the price. We're looking at perfectly competitive firms in the long run. We actually ended up in a scenario where the price they ended up setting was exactly equal to marginal cost, or we would say they had no markup, right? I think last class I kind of mentioned this term of markup refers to the difference between price and marginal cost. So monopolists and monopolistic competitive firms will be able to set the price above their marginal cost at the last quantity provided. For a perfectly competitive market, those two things in the long run will be equal to each other. So if we're thinking about which of the following is true about firms with a monopolistically competitive market, it results in a higher price than monopoly. Well, if we had a monopolist, right, we said that the demand curve would be kind of more inelastic. So it doesn't quite have as much market power or control over the price as a monopolist. So that actually wouldn't be true. It results in higher prices in a perfectly competitive market. Well, if we had a perfectly competitive market here, and I've got kind of a lot of things going on, so I'll draw a separate graph. We can kind of compare the two. We had a perfectly competitive market. We said in the long run, so we've got my average total cost, I've got my marginal cost. This isn't a perfect drawing. There you go. So average total cost. And then we said in the long run, that equilibrium price in a perfectly competitive market, which is basically firms' marginal revenue in a perfectly competitive market, will end up in the long run right here. This is my long run. And you'll notice that we basically end up at this point where we're at the minimum of our average total cost curve. Even when we have profit being equal to zero in this monopolistically competitive market, notice we're still far from that minimum point on our average total cost curve. And so the price is actually going to be higher for monopolistic competitive market. So thinking about the correct answer, we've already just identified it. But we can work through the other two to see why they're not true. So it results in a lower quantity of monopolists. Once again, similar idea. They don't have as much power. So the two things that we knew about a monopolist are going to happen is they're going to charge a higher price and produce a lower quantity in a perfectly competitive market. Because monopolistic competitive markets are somewhere in between, they don't have as much market power. They're still going to charge, try to draw this kind of to line up. Notice they're still charging a higher price in the perfectly competitive market, and the quantity is going to be lower, but it won't be quite as low, or the price won't be quite as high as a monopolist would charge. They don't have as much market power. The demand curve they're facing, right, isn't the entire demand for the product, it's just a portion of it. Okay? So that won't necessarily be the case. And to say it's economically more efficient than a perfectly competitive market, the perfectly competitive market is like our ideal scenario. It is the most efficient market, or it's the, I shouldn't say so. Yeah, I guess you could say it's the most allocatively efficient market. So one of the things that we will call this quantity for a perfectly competitive market, another term is that we're in allocative efficiency. Okay? So the quantity price of a perfectly competitive market, we say that's where everything is allocatively efficient. That is maximized surplus for society, for producers and consumers. Now, well, it may not individually, but kind of the sum of the two is maximized, right? Consumer and surplus, producer surplus are maximized at that allocated efficient point, or total surplus is maximized at that allocated efficient point. Any type of market power we have, whether or not it's monopolistically competitive, whether or not it's a pure monopoly, or I think we might touch on it today, but for sure next week on Monday, we have oligopoly power. All of those lead to inefficiencies in the market such that surplus is reduced. Okay, so that one doesn't make any sense, right? Perfectly competitive market is like our ideal, or kind of what we're always comparing to. Okay. Now, I probably wouldn't. I'll keep going on. I'll point it out later. So, if we're looking at a similar cost structure for a monopolistic competitive firm, in the short run, how many units should they produce? So if we're looking here, we should be able to identify kind of the equilibrium quantity that this firm should set in a monopolistically competitive market. Okay? So you've got kind of your marginal cost curve is that green curve, your marginal revenue curve is this one that's twice as steep as demand. There's one rule that all firms use to make their optimal quantity decision, or to choose the quantity that will maximize economic profits. Give you a little bit of time to kind of think or work on this one. Feel free to talk to the people around you, and then we'll kind of talk about it after the fact. And to kind of point out, So these are like 2-unit jumps. So here's 2, 4, 6, 8, all right, so on and so forth. Not 1-unit jumps. Yeah. You got your notes in front of you. For every market we've looked at, I've given you the same rule for no matter if it's a perfectly competitive firm. Notice there's going to be something that's true about why we chose this quantity. That is the exact same as why we chose this quantity over here. So no matter what type of market we had, we've been following the same rule to identify what the profit maximizing quantity is. Other than that, pretty much give you the answer. And I pointed out specific points that would have helped. We'll go to that 2-minute mark, and then we'll kind of talk about it here. All right. If you haven't gotten an answer in, take your best guess here. Everybody able to get their answer recorded? All right, I'm going to close it out. We got 24 people here today. It's very alarming for the upcoming exam. So, what rule should we always use to choose our optimal profit maximizing quantity? Nobody knows? Yeah, we produce up to the point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, right? For all these quantities in the competitive market, marginal revenue was above marginal cost. So for each unit we sold, we were increasing profits, right? The difference between the amount of revenue we had and the amount of costs that increase, well, that difference is how much we're benefiting or our profits. So for every unit here, we would continue to produce up to the point where those two things are equal to each other. That was perfect competitive market. For a monopolistic competitive market, I've got a lot of things going on here, so maybe I should use the slides. So for every unit down here, the marginal revenue is well above my marginal cost curve, so I'm adding to my profit, right? I kind of think about, I think I had this in the board once where I said, kind of think about it as my marginal profits. This is kind of weird, right? My marginal profits are just the difference between my additional revenues, my marginal revenues, my additional costs, right? So basically, I continue to produce as long as that marginal profit is greater than 0. So as long as marginal revenues are above marginal costs, I continue to produce because that's increasing my profits, right? That marginal profit value will be positive. I go up to the point where those two things are equal to each other. We said that's the quantity where I'm indifferent. I'll produce that unit, but any unit past that, well, now the marginal costs start to go above my marginal revenue. So if marginal cost is above marginal revenue, what happens to the amount of profit that I'm adding? It's negative. I'm just eating into my profits at that point. So I won't produce anywhere past that point where those two are equal. And the reason why we know past that point that relationship will happen is because marginal costs are increasing and marginal revenues are kind of decreasing. All right. Any questions on that? So marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue right here. We go down to this quantity. I kind of said we're, each one of these ticks represents 2, so 6. Huh? All right. Any questions going on now? So going into this next exam, like if you whatever you've got in front of you study, hammer into your head, the optimal quantity is always where the marginal revenue of that quantity is equal to the marginal cost, right? It doesn't matter what market we're looking at, okay? Now, in some markets, it gets a little weird because notice here, when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, well, for perfect competitive firms, marginal revenue is just whatever the market price is. So there's some additional things that might also hold, but no matter what market we're looking at, the optimal quantity Marginal revenue being equal to marginal cost will always hold. That will always be the profit maximizing point. Right? So we got 6 units. If we think about the price that they're going to set, right, it's going to be very similar to kind of our monopoly. So I kind of want to get a gauge of where we're at here. So we've identified, same sort of problem, we've identified that equilibrium quantity is 6. Right? So I know that that's the quantity the firm will produce. The way they set the price, right, we kind of talked about it over there, but they're going to try to determine how much the last consumer would be willing to pay at that quantity. Right? So there's something up here that represents how much people are willing to pay. We've talked about it before. So maybe think about one of these, even though it might be represented by a specific kind of letter, right? We've got demand here. Think about what demand reflects, right? We've said that supply reflects marginal cost, demand reflects something else. So if I'm trying to determine how much people are willing to pay at that quantity of 6, once I can use that demand curve to identify how much someone's willing to pay and hopefully identify the equilibrium price. Okay. So I'll give you a little bit of time to kind of work on this one here, and then we'll talk about it. All right. If you don't have an answer in, let's take our best guess here. We got 24. I thought we had 25. There we go. As I said, I thought we had 25 people in the last one. All right, I'm going to close it out. So, just like with a monopolist, right? Once I determine what my optimal quantity is, how do I figure out what price I should set it? Yeah, I just look at that quantity and I go up to where I get out in the demand curve, because we said demand reflects marginal benefits, and I would always buy something as long as the price is below, or I should say it the other way. As long as the amount that I benefit is greater than or equal to the price, like I would purchase that, right? Because the price is like my cost, marginal benefit, how much I'm benefiting. The difference between the two, you can think about that's like personal profits, even though we think about it more as like surplus. And I think about that would be like consumer profits almost, right? So we know that people will be willing to pay up to whatever their marginal benefit is. So if the demand curve reflects marginal benefits, you can see at that particular quantity, you can be willing to pay whatever that point is we're on the demand curve. So here, I know that I've got equilibrium quantity 6, at least hopefully we just went through that one and trying to identify that. So I go up to my demand curve. The value that the person would be willing to pay for that 6th unit would be $12. Right? Any questions on that one? Okay. So we've got our quantity, we've got our equilibrium price. Right? Actually, I want to ask a kind of conceptual question. So I said something was true about monopolistically competitive firms. One thing we said was no matter if we have positive or negative profits, the price I'm setting is always above marginal cost, right? So I'm always having this positive markup. So if I'm looking at these potential values here, for a monopoly or a monopolistically competitive firm, I could rule out which of these, just based off of looking at kind of what the marginal cost is at that optimal quantity of 6. Yeah, I can rule out 4 right away because I know that the price should be set above my marginal cost. The marginal cost of this 6th unit is 4, right? So if I gave you answers that were anything less than that marginal cost at that optimal unit, there's no way those could be correct, right? There has to be a price above marginal cost when we're looking at monopolistically competitive firms. So I guess one thing we could also work through here, I don't have a question for it, but just to get more practice. what would be true about the sign of my profits here? So would they be positive, negative, or zero? Yeah, so why are they positive? Yeah, once I identify that price, it's far above my average total cost. And so I know that I erase the equation, right? If we had price minus average total cost, that would now be a positive value. So I should have positive economic profits. Okay? So even in the long run, I kind of pointed this out earlier, but entry and exit lead to this scenario where in the long run, we end up with an equilibrium price that's exactly equal to our average total cost. Okay? So we know that in the long run, profits are going to be equal to zero, but we still have this markup, right? We still have price being above marginal cost, but we don't quite end up getting to this point where we're at the minimum part of the average total cost curve, like we did when we were in a perfectly competitive one. Okay? So this is kind of representing kind of a monopolistic competitive market in a long-run equilibrium. We identify that equilibrium quantity, determine what price we can set. When that price is exactly equal to average total cost, profits are zero. We would say this is a market in the long run. Sorry, a monopolistically competitive market. You know, we can kind of see from here, we're not at that minimum point of our average total cost curve. I've already mentioned this, but we do still have a markup, even with profits being equal to zero. Price is still above marginal cost, but we'll also start to call kind of the inefficiency of this market our excess capacity. So I don't really love this term, but that it is what it is, because excess capacity makes you almost think like the monopolistically competitive firm is producing too much. But this excess capacity, right, the capacity I basically haven't fulfilled it all, right? So you kind of think about where would we end up in a perfectly competitive market? Well, supply is reflecting marginal cost. In a perfectly competitive market, we should end up kind of out here. So you can kind of think about this area here is really representing what? Deadweight loss, right? We have excess capacity. We could produce more, right? Now that, you know, this I mean, we don't have a perfectly competitive market, so we're not going to get to that point. There's no incentive for the firm to produce more here. But for total surplus to be maximized, you kind of think about we should be producing at a higher quantity. Now, I won't really give you examples of the monopolistic competitive firms to identify kind of this deadweight loss, but you can kind of envision like it does exist. We looked at it with a monopoly, so we worked in a very similar manner. Okay. So, you know, here's like a nice comparison. You can kind of see we end up at a higher quantity with this perfectly competitive market, because we'd be at that minimum point of my average total cost curve. So we're at a lower quantity in this monopolistic competitive market. The price ends up being a little bit higher. Might be kind of hard to see, but if I could follow this horizontal line over, I really should have a price there. So even though we end up with zero profits, this is bad for the consumer because the price ends up being set higher. You can almost imagine if I drew the overall market demand curve up here, right? This was our demand curve for any one firm because they had to kind of just set the price at whatever the market equilibrium was. You can imagine if I also just drew the market equilibrium demand here, curve in here for this firm, that consumer surplus is going to be a little bit lower when we have a monopolistic competitive market. And that just intuitively makes sense because they have a little bit of market power and can set that price higher than at a perfectly competitive market. Okay. That's our kind of comparison between the two. Any questions here? All right, so you can kind of call that difference between that, what the quantity of perfectly competitive firm would choose and the quantity of the monopolistically competitive firm chooses. That difference is our excess capacity. Okay. And then that difference between price and marginal cost, that represents our markup. So we'll kind of use a clicker, so we'll kind of talk through this one. But anytime I have like a slide that has clicker on it, especially leading us up into the next exam, they're always good ones to be able to go back through and understand why the correct answer is what it is in those completed slides. So you'll notice, I think I have I kind of did some work between Monday and Wednesday's class. to make sure that all the slides lined up with what exactly we covered in each week, because I'm sometimes a little overzealous. And then I have all the complete slides up there with the exception of this week's slides, which I'll get posted up there sometime this weekend. Okay? So you can start reviewing those. So what's true about the long run equilibrium for firms in a monopolistically competitive industry? Okay? So it's kind of hard to envision. And if I was on the exam and I had this as a question, I mean, I can try to memorize all these rules, but I could also just be able to draw different markets, right? Once I have a visual, it's going to be very easy to answer this, okay? So with a monopolistically competitive market, what I know is true is that I've got this twice as steep marginal revenue curve, my demand curve, I've got some increasing marginal costs. What I know is that in the long run, whatever that equilibrium quantity is in the long run, and whatever price I've set, it should be that profits are equal to zero. So the only way that profits are equal to zero is if this is where my is if my average total cost curve is hitting my demand curve at this point. Because that way the price would be exactly equal to average total cost. And we know that when price is exactly equal to average total cost, our profits go to zero. Right? Or it kind of represents when our profits are zero. I should say that makes it go to zero. So we know that we're going to have an average total cost curve that hits demand at this point. But another thing that we should kind of remember is the minimum point of my average total cost curve is where marginal costs and average total costs are set. So because my demand curve and marginal cost curve, or because the price identified is up here on my demand curve, well, I know that the average total cost curve then can't be at its minimum there because it has to be at a minimum where it intersects that average total cost. And it's kind of this U shape. Right? So I mean, I guess we could like go into like geometry of why there's no Avogadro curve that, right? All those were equal, but we have to have this kind of U-shaped curve. So we know that we won't be at that minimum point of our average total cost. But price is equal to average total cost at the quantity that we've chosen. So this is the point where profits are equal to zero. Okay. Now that I have this visual, we can walk through, it's probably a lot easier. So we know that in the long run, marginal revenue is less than marginal cost. Well, first of all, we don't need a visual for this. Doesn't matter what market we're looking at. Will marginal revenue ever be less than marginal cost? No, that doesn't make any sense. We just be eating into our profits, right? We talked about that earlier. If marginal cost ever goes above marginal revenue, we're just changing profits by a negative value. Why would we do that? I mean, why would the company or why would the producer do that? So that one doesn't make any sense. We don't even have to worry about the rest of it. Price is equal to marginal revenue, which is equal to marginal cost, which is equal to the minimum point of the average total cost curve. Well, first of all, one thing that I've tried to hammer home today is that for these monopolistically competitive firms, they're still setting prices that are far above their marginal cost, right? So that should be a relationship, and we can see that here, right? That price is well above the marginal cost of that last thing I produce. So that one doesn't make any sense. In fact, I believe that one is kind of thinking about a perfectly competitive market, right? So for a perfectly competitive market, the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost, which is at the minimum point on the average total cost curve, which is equal to the equilibrium price. So B would be something that would hold for a perfectly competitive market. So then we go to C. And price is equal to average total cost. Well, we know that should hold because we know that in the long run profits are zero. So far, so good. Price is above marginal cost. Well, that was something we can see here, but also we know that there will be a markup for these monopolistically competitive firms. Whether there will be a difference between price and marginal cost. And that price will be above the minimum point of our average total cost curve, which is a little bit easier to see here from the visual, because we know that that minimum point of the average total cost will be wherever it intersects the marginal cost curve. So C is going to be our correct answer, but why would D not make sense? Price being above average total cost would imply that profits are what? Positive, right? Price is above average total cost, that implies profits are positive. So we've got C being the correct answer here. So this would be kind of how I would think through these on the exam. Especially when you're asked something like this, like think through each one. Try to rule all or 3 of the 4 out, right? And then because I think it's a little bit easier to rule answers out than sometimes it is like you go through and you're like, oh, I think everything's correct there, so that's the correct answer. Try to rule out the other 3. If you can rule out the other 3, you can be a lot more confident in the one that you chose is correct. Any questions over anything there?
So you would set something along the lines of, E is equal to ABC.
Oh, so if profits are equal to 0, we know that the only way that's possible, well, I guess there's 2 ways technically. If I produce 0, then my profits would be 0, right? But if we're at some positive level of production, the only way profits are 0 is if price is equal to my average total cost. That would be asking.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's why we knew once we set the price, like I originally started out, I didn't even have the average total cost curve up here. Right? I just had my demand, marginal revenue curve that was quite steep, marginal cost. I then identified my equilibrium quantity and price and said, well, if that's the equilibrium price, I know that the average total cost curve would have to hit the demand curve right at that point for profits to be 0, because the only way profits are 0 is the price is equal to average total cost. Any other questions? Does that get at what you were asking?
Yeah.
Okay. Excuse me. So, I think we've already kind of talked about all of this. All right. We want to think about why there's some deadweight loss that exists with a monopolistic competitive market, even though in the long run we have profits being equal to 0. It's because we're underproducing, right? Also, so we're not at our lowest cost point. We're underproducing. We have this excess capacity, but that results in us having average costs that are much higher than what they could be. Right? So that's going to kind of lead to some deadweight loss. We also have this markup, which is going to be creating some kind of losses. So the fact that we weren't at the lowest average cost we could be, that was kind of causing some deadweight loss from producers, right? Because not operating at the lowest cost point would be bad for producers. The other thing we had was that the price was above marginal cost, or that the price was higher than what a perfect competitive market would set. So you kind of imagine that is going to cause some deadweight loss coming from consumers, right? Because they're paying a higher price. So both of these things, excess capacity and then this markup over marginal cost, are going to be creating deadweight loss, but from 2 different groups. Excess capacity causing more of a deadweight loss coming from producers, the markup causing more deadweight loss coming from consumers. I think we've probably talked about almost everything here. We have this deadweight loss. It's not good overall for society. If I was the government or like a central planner, I probably would want to try to step into this market because I know it's not at the allocated efficient point. However, it's pretty hard to fix this problem because if I step in, given the cost structures in the long run, these companies are at 0 profit. So if I try to move that price lower, well, that's going to eat into their profits. So unless I can, also alter kind of what the demand curve that those firms are facing, they're going to see negative profits. I'll see some firms exit, but I'm not going to be able to solve this problem very easily as a regulator. And that kind of comes from the fact that there's differentiated demand for each one of these products, but all of their demand is kind of tied to overall demand for that specific good. So, each car company faces a slightly different demand curve, even though there is an overall market demand for automobiles. So, what that really says is potentially the number of firms that are within that market aren't optimal, even if we've gotten to this point where profits equal 0, because we have kind of this deadweight loss that exists. Excuse me. So one thing that is really hard to identify, and I'll mention it today, we will not look at externality stuff until after this next exam. Next week, we'll see how quickly we kind of move through things. We'll cover new material on Monday that you'll be expected to know on the exam. But on Wednesday and Friday, I might introduce some new topics that won't be on the exam. And then on Monday, we'll probably do some exam review, leading us into that final exam on Wednesday. just want to give you guys a little bit more time, even though I'll be covering some new material. It won't be expected, or sorry, Wednesday and Friday's material won't be expected to answer questions about it on the exam. Right? So the last material that you'll be expected to answer questions on would be anything we cover on Monday. But this idea of externalities, which will be something we cover kind of after the fact, after this next exam, is just the idea that we can't measure all the benefits that exist in a market just from looking at producers and consumers, that potentially that there's benefits to people outside of that market as well. You can kind of think about a negative externality as pollution, right? Well, if a company, the costs and benefits that consumers and producers of coal, electricity face, right? They're going to make a certain decision because they're not concerned about all the people that are having huge costs due to their pollution, right? So this is the idea of this term externality, and that potentially when we're looking at these monopolistic competitive markets, we're not yet factoring in, so I just want to kind of foreshadow some stuff. We're not yet factoring in that there could be some surplus that is gained from consumers just being able to have a variety of products they consume, right? And that there's potentially benefits that consumers derive from not having to purchase the exact same formula or the exact same ingredients recipe for Coca-Cola, that they can have different types of products, and there's potentially some benefit to that. So just to be fair, we're talking about deadweight loss. There might be some things we haven't factored in to why monopolistically competitive markets where we don't really see a lot of regulation. Now, it could be also that there's some externalities that exist that are negative, which are when we see these new firms enter the market, right? This is going to cause different degrees of elasticity in our demand, right? The more substitutes there are, we know that means demand is going to be more elastic. People can be more responsive because there's just more variety of things people can choose from. So when more firms enter this market, there's kind of this negative externality to the existing firms, which is that their demand curves are becoming more elastic, which it's not one-to-one, but it's there's a correlation to meaning that they're becoming flatter. So you kind of imagine as they become flatter, they're starting to get more and more like a perfect competitive market. So there's some negative externalities to the existing firms. So these inefficiencies are really hard to measure, right? These positive and negative externalities that exist are really hard to measure. And so when policymakers look at an industry and there isn't any one firm that has a huge market share, but they all have similar products that are slightly differentiated, they usually don't step in, right? Or they usually don't have, because if I can't measure all these additional benefits and costs that exist, then I might be actually stepping in and making things worse. And so that's why we don't really see a lot of regulation. One thing that's kind of tied, two things actually, I think we'll get through, before we end class today, that are tied to these monopolistic competitive markets that are kind of interesting to start thinking about. The first would be advertising, right? So if I'm currently in a perfectly competitive market, maybe if I start to advertise so that I can convince people that my product is a little bit better than the other close substitutes, right? Pepsi starts dumping a bunch of money into their advertising. What they're really trying to do is convince consumers that their product is different than all these other colas, right? So through advertising, potentially I can kind of get a more inelastic demand curve for my product, which allows me to have a higher markup, right? And potentially earn some positive profits in this monopolistic competitive industry in the short run. So there's always going to be this incentive for firms to advertise, right? Because they're wanting to draw in as much of the overall demand, maybe for like colas or automobiles, as possible, right? So if I can differentiate my product from the other ones the most, I'm going to have a larger portion of the overall demand for, for my particular brand or for my particular version of this good. So, if we look at markets where we have slightly differentiated products, we see those are the ones that there's a lot of advertising. So I bring up these examples of cola and cola, pop or soda, whatever you want to call it, and automobiles, because if you watch any type of show, you will see those advertisements all the time. Another good example is potentially pharmaceutical companies and their particular drugs. Like if there's a couple different brands of drugs that treat, I don't know, there's basically a commercial for every type of illness you could ever see on TV. And that's because there are a variety of companies that produce basically the same product. And so they need to convince you that theirs is the one you should buy, right? Now, a lot of people, would disagree of whether or not this is effective, because in doing so, making these products more differentiated, as this demand curve becomes steeper, we start to see that markup gets even larger, deadweight loss gets even larger, excess capacity gets even larger, right? So it's going to kind of create more inefficiency in the market. So that would be one argument. That would be the kind of the critique, right? We're wasting resources as well, right? Spending money on advertising, all we're really doing there is changing our cost structure. So making it so that, if I'm thinking about increasing my costs, well, I didn't have to do that, and I could have sold the same quantity. We'll get into a little bit about this when we talk about a topic in the future called game theory. So that's going to be right around the corner after that next exam, to where firms just start out, like, it's always better to be the one who's spending the most on advertising. So we end up with no real gain, because there's incentive for everybody to put money into advertising, and we're just wasting money, we're wasting resources. Right? And you could also argue that this advertising, like, it's artificially manipulating demand, right? It's making people think that their demand for this product is somewhere up here, when in fact, it convinces a person to buy it, and when they actually, use the product, they realize their marginal benefit was actually much lower, right? This commercial convinced me that the new Taco Bell, product was going to be this amazing, like, life-changing good, and then I go buy it, and it tastes like Taco Bell, right? So it gets potentially kind of causing there to be like an artificial demand, and convincing people to spend more money or purchase this good, when in reality the marginal benefit was much lower conversely. It also impedes competition. Like, we generally want as much competition as possible, because that drives us closer and closer to this perfectly competitive market, which drives us closer and closer to having kind of deadweight loss being zero, right? Having total surplus being maximized. However, to be kind of fair, we'll defend advertising because it also provides useful information. So even though sometimes it might create artificial demand, if I don't know that a product exists, right, I'm made aware of it through advertising, then potentially there's a huge surplus gain from that, right? Because it's presenting new information. Right? It also allows us, through advertising, especially if we're advertising with prices, it gives consumers more information about the available substitutes, right? So if I don't know that, maybe I need to go buy some groceries, or I don't know, a gallon of milk, and I don't know that right now Meijer's having a special and milk's only 50 cents or something super low, well, then I'll go spend a higher amount of money, and as a consumer, I'm hurt by that, right? There was a cheaper good out there, and so potentially advertising actually helps create competition as well, because it makes consumers more aware of the substitutes and what prices are. So it might promote competition in that way. There was a study that kind of was looking at eyeglasses and found that when they prohibited advertising for this product, and it had something to do with the fact that it's like technically medical, that they actually found that when they prohibited advertising for this, people ended up paying higher prices for eyeglasses, right? So potentially, if we just got rid of advertising, there are some evidence that it wouldn't really be good for consumers, right? It is providing us with information of products existing as well as their prices, so it might help create competition as well. So, you've got kind of both sides here. I think we'll kind of end here. We'll kind of touch back on this. I give advertising and then also brand loyalty. Once we do that, we'll look at the final market that I could ask questions about on the exam, which is an oligopoly, right? So we'll kind of work through one more model. It's very similar to what we've already done. Other than that, have a good weekend, and I will see you guys on Monday, okay?